Why was the pilot still holding a pistol when the rescuers found her? The mountains had been watching long before the war began. They watched the burning wreckage now too, silent and patient, as if waiting to see what the small figures moving through the frost would do next. 4 Navy SEALs moved carefully through the broken valley before dawn, their boots crunching over frozen gravel, rifles raised. The smell of jet fuel hung in the air like a warning. They had come for a pilot. What they found didn't make sense. The wreckage of the A-10 lay torn across the slope, its armored cockpit still intact. The aircraft had done what it was designed to do, protect the person inside. But the ejection seat was gone. The parachute hung shredded on the rocks hundreds of meters away. 7 bodies lay scattered across the hillside. Not American. Not friendly. Each one dropped by a single precise shot. Master Chief Owen Briggs crouched beside the nearest one and studied the wound. Clean. Controlled. No panic in the shot placement. Whoever had done this had moved between them calmly. But pilots weren't supposed to do that. Pilots flew above the battlefield. They didn't hunt on it. The youngest member of the team, Petty Officer, found her first. His voice crackled over the comms, confused. "Master Chief, I found Ghost Rider." Briggs arrived seconds later. The woman sitting in the depression of rock didn't look like someone who had just survived a missile strike and a crash landing. She looked focused. Her pistol was steady in both hands, aimed directly at Briggs' chest. She was small, barely 5'4". Her flight suit was torn and dark with dried blood. A rough bandage wrapped her shoulder. Her left thigh was stitched closed with careful black thread. Not field dressing. Actual sutures. Her eyes didn't show fear. Only calculation. "Call sign," she said quietly. "Neptune 6, Briggs replied. "SEAL Team 6, we're here to bring you home." She studied his ID without lowering the pistol. Then finally, she lowered it. "Captain Sloan Drake," she said, "Ghost Rider." No relief, no smile, just information. The team medic stepped forward immediately. He examined the wound in her thigh. Then he stopped. The stitching was perfect. Even tension, clean closure. Better than what most field medics could do in daylight with full supplies. "Who stitched this?" he asked. "I did," she replied calmly. Blinked once, then shifted beside them and winced. Captain Drake turned her head instantly. "Your man," she said. "Right side injury, breathing shallow, possibly tension pneumothorax." Froze. That diagnosis should have taken minutes. She had made it in seconds, from 15 feet away. "Talk me through it," said quietly. She did. Calm, precise, clinical. Needle decompression, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Followed her instructions and the trapped air hissed from his chest. The young SEAL sucked in a desperate breath. The silence that followed was heavy. The team exchanged glances. Pilots weren't trained like this. Finally said what everyone was thinking. "No offense, Captain, but pilots don't usually do all that." Sloan Drake didn't react. "I'm aware of the expectation," she said softly. Then she stood. Not dramatically, just stood. Like someone who had already calculated the cost of the pain and decided it was acceptable. She walked to a fallen rifle on the ground. A sniper rifle dropped beside one of the dead fighters. In 4 seconds she checked the bolt, the crown of the barrel, the scope alignment. Stared. "Can you use that?" he asked. She didn't answer. Instead she studied the secondary landing zone, she said quietly, is exposed from the north for 400 meters. Briggs looked up from his map. She pointed to a narrow ravine cutting through the rock. "That route takes longer," she continued, "but it keeps us below the—" Briggs studied the terrain. She was right. And she had calculated it in seconds. They began moving through the mountains as dawn slowly bled into the sky. The cold bit into their lungs. Leaned on pale but stable. Sloane walked beside them silently, favoring her injured leg only slightly. After several minutes, finally asked the question that had been sitting in his mind. "Where did you learn medicine?" "My father started it," she said. "And the rest?" "My uncle finished it." They walked for a while in silence before she added quietly. "He was force recon." Nodded slowly. "That explained some things. But not everything." "What about the shooting?" asked from behind them. "My father started that too," she said. "When?" "I was 10. No one spoke after that. Because suddenly, the picture forming in their minds was becoming something different. Not a pilot who survived a crash. Something else. Someone who had been preparing her entire life without anyone noticing. But the real problem hadn't even begun yet. Because as they climbed the next ridge, Briggs checked his radio again. A signal was still transmitting from the crashed aircraft. Not the emergency beacon. Something else. Something hidden. And someone out there clearly wanted it back. When Briggs looked up, Sloane Drake was already watching the ridge through the scope of the captured sniper rifle. "Captain," he said quietly, "how good are you at distance shooting?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied the wind brushing across the tall grass below. Then she lay prone behind a rock, settled into the rifle, and asked calmly, "How much distance?" Why would someone risk an entire rescue mission just to recover a single piece of equipment? The answer arrived less than 10 minutes later. Through the sniper scope, Sloane Drake saw movement on the western ridge. A shadow shifting between two rocks, 720 meters away. The wind moved in soft, restless currents through the valley. Sloane watched the grass below, the way it leaned and lifted again. Her father had once told her that wind never lied, people did, machines did, but wind simply moved. If you knew how to read it. "Wind northeast," Briggs whispered beside her. 12 knots, gusting 14. She absorbed the numbers and folded them into the quiet arithmetic building in her mind. The rifle wasn't perfectly aligned. She had noticed that earlier during the quick inspection. The scope was slightly off-axis from the bore. Most shooters would compensate slowly. She had already compensated before lying down. The shadow shifted again on the ridge. Someone watching them. Waiting. A sniper. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. Patience, her father used to say, wasn't waiting. It was knowing exactly what you were waiting for. The shadow leaned forward slightly. A barrel. She exhaled halfway and pressed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The bullet traveled down the valley in less than a second. It struck rock 6 inches left of the target. Sloane didn't react. She had already corrected the calculation. The bolt cycled smoothly. 3 seconds later, the shape appeared again, confident now that the first shot had missed. The second shot didn't miss. The figure collapsed instantly behind the rock. Silence followed. Stared at her. "No way," he muttered. No celebration, no comment. Sloane simply stood, slung the rifle over her shoulder, and said quietly, "We have 4 minutes before his team adjusts their approach." They moved again. Faster now. But the mountain wasn't empty anymore. Briggs' radio crackled. A compressed signal flashed across the screen. 3 groups. All converging. Sloane stopped walking. "That signal from my aircraft," she said quietly. "It isn't a beacon." Briggs looked at her. "What is it?" She hesitated. "Not from fear. From certainty." "A tracker," she said. Silence rippled through the team. Briggs felt something cold settle in his chest. You didn't install it. No. Then who did? She looked toward the distant wreckage. I think someone inside our own chain of command. The realization hung in the air like a storm about to break. Because if the tracker was inside her aircraft, then whoever planted it knew exactly where she had been flying. And exactly where she had crashed. The radio crackled again. Briggs scanned the southeast slope through binoculars, then slowly lowered them. The men approaching weren't Taliban fighters. Their equipment was clean, standardized, American. Noticed first. Why are they wearing our gear? No one answered. Sloane had already seen it. They're not here for us, she said quietly. They're here for the module in my aircraft. Briggs looked at her. What module? The avionics package behind the cockpit, she said. Someone installed something inside it 6 weeks ago. And you reported it? Yes. What did your commander say? That the mission orders were valid. The valley grew quiet again. Briggs felt the pieces sliding into place. Someone had used her aircraft. Someone had planted a transmitter. Someone had guided a missile to it. And now a team was arriving to recover whatever had been inside. Or erase it. The approaching group was now 500 meters away. Too organized. Too disciplined. Sloane dropped to one knee and raised the rifle again. She said calmly into the radio, status. Blood pressure dropping, replied. Shrapnel nicked a femoral branch. I need 6 minutes. Sloane looked at the approaching figures. They would reach firing distance in 4. You have 6, she said. Then she went prone again. The valley held its breath. Her father once told her that the moment of decision should happen before the battle began. That way, when the moment arrived, all that remained was action. The lead figure stopped. Raised binoculars. She could see the outline of his face through the scope. 400 meters. 390. Her finger tightened. The rifle fired. The man dropped instantly. The rest of the group scattered. 2 left. 2 right. Professional movement. Return fire snapped against the rocks around her. She slid 6 feet along the ledge without lifting the rifle. Second target. Shot. Third. Rifle cracked from the flank. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds. Then the valley fell silent again. 4 bodies lay on the slope. One remaining man began retreating behind the rocks. Sloane watched him through the scope, then slowly lowered the rifle. He's leaving, she said. No one spoke for a moment, because everyone had just realized something. This woman wasn't just surviving the battlefield. She was controlling it. Finally broke the silence. I owe you an apology, Captain. For what? For assuming you were just the pilot. She looked at him for a moment. You made the logical assumption, she said calmly. The information was incomplete. Then she turned back toward the mountains. The sky was growing brighter now. Extraction would come soon. But the deeper question was still waiting in the air. If someone inside the system had tried to eliminate her aircraft, then the crash in the valley hadn't been an accident. And the real danger had only just begun. Because somewhere far above the mountains, people in quiet offices were already asking the same question. Why was Captain Sloane Drake still alive? How did a wounded pilot become the one person holding the entire rescue team alive? The first shot had already changed everything. The valley went silent after the last echo rolled off the mountains. Smoke from the wreckage drifted slowly across the lower slope, thin and gray against the rising morning light. Somewhere far away a hawk cried, the sound thin and distant in the cold air. But none of the men on the ridge were looking at the sky. They were looking at Captain Sloane Drake. She lay prone behind the broken rock shelf, the captured resting steady against its pack. Her breathing was slow, controlled, almost detached. The kind of breathing that came from years of training your body not to panic when everything around you demanded panic. 4 enemy fighters lay motionless down the slope. The 5th had disappeared behind the rocks. She had let him go. Not out of mercy. Out of discipline. Briggs was the first to move. "Status check," he said quietly over the comms. His voice came back first, calm, focused, working. "His pressure is stabilizing. Fluids are running. He's conscious." A pause. "Good work back there, Captain." Sloane didn't respond. Not because she hadn't heard him, but because she was already scanning the valley again. Her mind wasn't celebrating what had just happened. It was still running calculations. Terrain, angles, approach routes. People who survived long enough in places like this learned something important. Victory was never the moment when the shooting stopped. Victory was when you finally left the valley alive. And they weren't there yet. Slid beside her behind the rocks, peering through his own optics. "You didn't hesitate," he said quietly. "About what?" "About taking those shots." She adjusted the rifle slightly against the rock. They were moving toward an injured man. "That's not what I meant." He watched her carefully. "You knew they might be American." That question lingered in the cold air. For the first time since the team had found her, Sloane was quiet for a moment. Then she said something very simple. "If someone chooses to hunt Americans in a valley like this, they've already made their decision." There was no anger in her voice. Just clarity. Nodded slowly. It wasn't the answer of someone trying to justify what she had done. It was the answer of someone who had already accepted it long before pulling the trigger. Behind them, finished securing the IV line into his arm. The young SEAL's breathing had steadied, but the exhaustion was written all over his face. "Captain," said weakly, turning his head toward her. She crawled back from the firing position and knelt beside him. "Yes. I think you saved my life twice today." She checked the bandage on his chest, tightening the seal slightly. "You're still breathing," she said quietly. "That's the part that matters." He watched her for a moment, studying her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "You don't look like someone who just shot 4 people." She almost smiled. "Neither do you." Briggs was standing a few meters away, studying his radio again. The signal from the crashed aircraft was still transmitting, still pulsing quietly through the valley. Like a beacon. Or bait. And that bothered him more than the firefight. Because whoever had installed that transmitter had known exactly what it would do. They knew a rescue team would come. They knew someone would follow the signal. Which meant someone had expected this entire situation to happen. He turned back toward Sloane. "Captain," he said, "you mentioned earlier that the flight assignments felt wrong." She nodded once. "They were too specific." "How specific?" She took a slow breath. "Coordinates, altitude, exact time windows. For close air support." "Yes. That's unusual." "Very." The team exchanged looks. Because the more they talked about it, the more the story stopped sounding like a routine combat mission and started sounding like something else entirely. Sloane continued quietly. 3 times in 6 weeks, I was assigned to fly identical routes over the valley. Did you engage targets? No. Then why were you there? That's the question I asked. Briggs felt a tightness in his chest. And what did command say? They said the missions were classified surveillance support. She looked down the slope toward the burned aircraft. But surveillance doesn't require exact second timing. Missile ambush does. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood it. Someone had known exactly when her aircraft would pass through that valley. Someone had told the man with the shoulder-fired missile where to stand, which meant the missile strike hadn't been luck. It had been scheduled. Looked up from the ground, pale. Why shoot down our own pilot? Sloan didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't something anyone wanted to say. Finally, Briggs said it. Because of whatever was in that avionics module. Sloan nodded slowly. That's my guess. Stood, wiping his hands on a cloth. Which means the people who attacked us earlier. They were here to retrieve it, Briggs finished. The wind picked up across the ridge. The valley below shimmered slightly as the sun climbed higher. Morning was arriving. And with it, visibility. That was bad news, because anyone searching for them would now have an easier time finding them. Briggs checked his watch. Extraction bird is 20 minutes out. 20 minutes. In a valley that now knew exactly where they were. Crouched beside Sloan again. Can I ask something? You already did. This one's different. She raised an eyebrow slightly. He nodded toward the rifle. You handled that thing like you've used it for years. She looked down at the weapon. I grew up shooting. Hunting. Yes. What kind? Her answer was quiet. Whatever needed hunting. He studied her face again. You're not joking. No. A faint memory moved through her mind then. Cold mornings in a wooden blind. Her father's voice whispering instructions while frost covered the grass. Breathe. Wait. The first shot is the only one that matters. She had been 11 years old. The rifle had been almost as long as she was tall. And her father had watched patiently while she learned how to hold still. Still enough to listen to the world. Still enough to know when to act. She pushed the memory aside. This wasn't the time for remembering. A faint rumble reached them from far away. Everyone froze. Helicopter blades. The extraction bird. Relief passed quietly through the team. But Sloan's eyes narrowed. That's too early. Briggs checked the radio. No signal confirmation yet. The rumble grew louder. But something felt wrong. The sound was too low. Too fast. Then cursed under his breath. That's not our bird. The helicopter crested the far ridge. Black. Unmarked. And moving directly toward the crash site. Sloan's heart slowed. Not faster. Slower. Because now the picture was finally complete. They're coming for the module, she said quietly. The helicopter banked toward the burning wreckage. Briggs raised his rifle. Everyone moved now. They began moving toward the extraction point through the rocks, supported between and behind them. The helicopter descended toward the destroyed aircraft. Sloan looked back once. Watching. Calculating. Because she understood something the others hadn't said yet. Whoever was inside that helicopter wasn't worried about rescuing anyone. They were worried about destroying evidence. And if that meant killing the witnesses, then the valley wasn't finished with them yet. She tightened her grip on the rifle and kept moving. Somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the calm discipline and quiet precision, another feeling stirred. Not fear. Not anger. Something colder. Determination. Because the people hunting them had made one mistake. They thought the pilot was the weakest person on the mountain. And sometimes the quietest person in the room. was the one who had already decided how the story would end. Why would a helicopter arrive at a crash site and ignore the survivors? The sound reached them before the machine appeared. A low, heavy thrum that rolled across the like distant thunder. At first it almost sounded comforting. The familiar rhythm of rotor blades meant rescue, meant extraction, meant the long night might finally be ending. But Sloane Drake stopped walking. Something in the sound was wrong. She turned her head slowly, listening. Briggs noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked. "That's not our bird." The others froze. A moment later, the helicopter crested the ridge. Black, unmarked, flying low and fast, and heading directly toward the burning wreckage of the A-10. Not toward the team, not toward the emergency signal, toward the aircraft, toward the module. For a second, no one spoke. Then said the quiet thing everyone was realizing at the same time. "They're not here for us." Sloane watched the helicopter bank toward the crash site. Her mind began moving quickly, the same calm calculations that had kept her alive since the moment she ejected from the aircraft. Distance, time, intent. "They'll land at the wreck," she said. 5 minutes, maybe less. Briggs checked his radio. Still nothing from the real extraction team. Static, broken signal. He looked at Sloane again. "You think they're the same group that came after us?" "No." "Why not?" She kept watching the helicopter descend. Those men on the slope were trying to retrieve something. And these? They're trying to erase it. The helicopter dropped behind the ridge, out of sight. A thin column of smoke rose from the wreckage below. Briggs made the decision instantly. "We move now, secondary LZ." Lifted to his feet again, the young SEAL gritted his teeth, trying to hide the pain that shot through his leg. "I can walk," insisted. "You can limp," corrected. They began moving again, deeper through the ravine Sloane had identified earlier. The ground was uneven, broken by narrow gullies and jagged shelves of rock. Frost still clung to the shadows, making every step treacherous. Sloane moved near the rear of the formation now, the slung across her back. Watching. Always watching. Slowed until he was walking beside her. "Can I ask you something?" "You usually do." He nodded toward the helicopter that had disappeared behind the ridge. "You knew this might happen, didn't you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped carefully over a narrow gap in the rock. "I suspected something was wrong," she said finally. "With the mission. With the pattern." "What pattern?" She glanced back at him. "The assignment, the timing, the coordinates." He waited. "My father used to say something," she continued quietly. "When things don't make sense, it's usually because someone is hiding part of the equation. And you think someone hid part of yours." "Yes." The ravine narrowed as they moved deeper into it. High walls of stone blocked the wind, making the air feel strangely still. Up ahead, Briggs raised his fist. The team stopped instantly. Everyone crouched behind the rocks. Briggs was looking at the ridge above them through binoculars. "Movement," he whispered. Sloane slowly unslung the rifle and moved beside him. "Where?" He pointed. 200 meters above their position. Small figures moving along the skyline. She adjusted the scope. 3 men. Maybe 4. Too far away to see details clearly. But they were scanning the valley. Searching. "They came from the helicopter," Briggs said. "Yes." "How many?" "At least 4. Briggs lowered the binoculars. "They're sweeping the area. Looking for survivors. Or witnesses." The wind shifted again, sliding softly through the rocks. For a moment, the entire valley felt like it was holding its breath. Then Sloane spoke quietly. "They'll split up soon." "Why?" "Because they know we're moving." Frowned. "How?" She tapped the small radio on Briggs' vest. "That transmitter in my aircraft is still broadcasting." Realization spread through the group. "They can track it," said weakly. "Yes," Sloane replied. "But the signal is stationary." Briggs understood immediately. "They think we're still at the crash site." "For now." He looked back at the ridge. "We need to reach the LZ before they figure that out." "How long?" asked. Briggs checked his map. 20 minutes if holds up." Glanced at his patient. "He'll hold." Nodded stubbornly. "I'm not dying in a ditch after all this." Sloane almost smiled at that. "Almost." Briggs lowered his voice. "Captain, if they realize we've moved, where will they intercept?" She studied the terrain around them carefully. Her eyes moved slowly over the ridges, the gullies, the narrow passes. Then she pointed to a rocky saddle 1/2 kilometer ahead. "There." "Why?" "Because it's the only place where the ravine opens up." Briggs studied it. She was right. If someone wanted to cut them off, that's where they would do it. Exhaled slowly. "So we're walking into an ambush." "Possibly." Comforting. Sloane met his eyes. "Not if we arrive first." Briggs nodded. "Then we move faster." They began climbing again, pushing through the narrow stone corridor. Leaned heavily on now, but he refused to slow down. Above them, the figures on the ridge disappeared from view. Searching. Closing in. The silence between the team grew heavier as they climbed. Until finally spoke again. "Captain, I've been meaning to ask something." Sloane kept walking. "What?" He hesitated. "When we first found you, those 7 bodies around the crash." "Yes." "You took them all down alone." She adjusted her grip on the rifle strap. "Yes." "How long after you ejected?" "About 20 minutes." He stopped walking for a moment. "You fought 7 men with a pistol." "Yes." "And stitched your own leg afterward." "Yes." Shook his head slowly. "That's not normal." She looked back at him calmly. "War rarely is." They reached the rocky saddle a few minutes later. The ground flattened slightly, opening into a small plateau surrounded by scattered boulders. Briggs studied the area. Extraction birds should arrive here. Sloane moved to the edge of the ridge and scanned the valley below through the scope. Her eyes narrowed. Something moved in the distance. Not one shape. Several. Coming fast. She lowered the rifle. They figured it out. Briggs followed her gaze. A group of figures was moving up the slope toward them. 8, maybe 9 men. Well-equipped. Disciplined. And closing quickly. Exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, "there goes the quiet exit." Briggs turned to Sloane. "Captain, we hold here until the bird arrives." She nodded. "How long?" 10 minutes. She looked at the approaching men again. Then at the terrain around them. Her mind moved through angles and distances the way a chess player moves through positions. Finally she spoke. "We can hold." Briggs waited. "But we'll need to control the ridge lines." He studied the rocks around them. "You take overwatch." "Yes." "Distance?" 500 meters at the far slope. He nodded once. "Then it's yours." Sloane moved quickly across the rocks, finding a narrow ledge that gave her clear sight of the valley below. She lay prone again. The rifle settled into her shoulder like it belonged there. Behind her, the team prepared their defensive positions. Kept working beside, checking the bandages. Briggs and spread out across the rocks. Below them, the enemy team continued climbing. Sloane watched them through the scope. Calm. Still. Focused. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her memory again. Preparation isn't fear. It's respect for the moment before it arrives. 500 meters. 480. She exhaled slowly. The valley felt very quiet. Then she whispered into the radio. They're entering range. And the waiting ended. How do you hold a ridge when you know you're already outnumbered? Sloane Drake felt the cold stone beneath her elbows as she steadied the rifle. 500 meters. The figures below were spreading out now, moving with the quiet precision of men who had done this many times before. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They hunted. Through the scope she saw one of them kneel, scanning with binoculars, searching for the same thing she was. Movement. Weakness. A mistake. Behind her, the SEAL team finished setting their positions among the scattered rocks. Briggs spoke quietly into the radio. Status. Overwatch ready, Sloane replied. His voice came next, left flank covered. Answered last, stable, I'm on rear watch. Tried to laugh softly. Stable is generous. Pressed a hand against his shoulder. Save your energy. The wind slid across the ridge, carrying the distant smell of burned fuel from the wrecked A-10 far behind them. Sloane's eye never left the scope. 450 meters. The enemy team was splitting into two elements now, one drifting left through a shallow ravine, the other climbing directly toward the saddle. Briggs crawled beside Sloane. How many? 9. He nodded slowly. Disciplined. Yes. Military. Feels like it. He studied them through his binoculars. They're moving too clean for random militia. Sloane didn't respond, because she was thinking the same thing. These weren't scavengers. They weren't opportunists. They had come here for something specific. And now they were making sure no one else left with it. 380 meters. The man with binoculars lowered them suddenly. For one brief moment, Sloane had the strange feeling he was looking directly at her. Then he raised a hand. The team below froze. Contact, Sloane whispered into the radio. They see us, Briggs asked. Not exactly. But they suspected. And suspicion was enough. The first shot came from below. A sharp crack that split the air and shattered a rock near his position. The valley erupted. Returned fire immediately. Briggs shifted position, rifle snapping into his shoulder. Hold your lanes, he ordered. Bullets smacked against stone. Dust sprayed into the air. But Sloane stayed still. Her breathing slowed. Her finger rested gently against the trigger. 350 meters. She found the man with binoculars again. The one giving signals. The one directing the others. He moved quickly, ducking between rocks. But for a fraction of a second, he paused. That was enough. The rifle barked. The recoil nudged softly against her shoulder. Through the scope she watched the man collapse backward onto the slope. Silence in her breathing. Noise everywhere else. Lead her down, she said calmly. Briggs didn't look surprised. Keep thinning them. Two of the enemy fighters dragged the body behind cover. The others moved faster now, spreading wider. Trying to close the distance. 300 meters. Fired short controlled bursts. Left side pushing. I see them, Briggs replied. Another shot from Sloane's rifle. Another figure dropped mid-stride. The remaining fighters began firing toward her position. Rocks exploded around the ledge. Fragments sprayed across her sleeves. But she didn't move. Glanced toward her from behind a boulder. She's exposed. Briggs shook his head. Leave her. Another shot from Sloane's rifle. Another body on the slope. Watched from his seated position against the rock wall, breathing hard through the pain in his leg. How many does that make? 3, said quietly. Looked toward the narrow ledge where Sloane lay perfectly still. I've never seen shooting like that. Nodded slowly. Neither have I. Below them, the attackers slowed their advance. Uncertainty creeping into their movements. Because every time someone moved into open ground, Sloane found them. 280 meters. Another shot. Another fall. Briggs allowed himself a tight grin. They didn't expect resistance like this. Fired again from the left flank. They didn't expect her. The enemy fighters shifted strategy. Instead of pushing forward, they began spreading toward the outer edges of the ridge. Trying to flank. Trying to force the defenders into multiple angles. Sloane saw it immediately. They're widening. Trying to box us, Briggs said. Yes. He checked the sky briefly. Still no helicopter. How long? 4 minutes, he said. Sloane exhaled slowly. 4 minutes could feel very long. A bullet struck the rock inches from her scope. Another snapped past her shoulder. They were targeting the sniper now. Good. That meant the others had breathing room. She adjusted her angle slightly, sliding the rifle barrel between 2 stones. A new target appeared below. Running between rocks. The rifle fired. The man stumbled and rolled down the slope. 5 down. The remaining attackers hesitated again. The silence between bursts of gunfire grew heavier. Whispered from behind his cover. Who the hell is she? Briggs didn't answer immediately. Because he was watching Sloane through the corner of his eye. Watching the way she moved. The way she didn't move. Watching the strange calm that surrounded her even while bullets chipped the rock around her. Finally he said quietly, She's someone who's been here before. Another enemy fighter appeared on the far left ridge. Closer now. 200 meters. Sloane tracked him through the scope. Waited. Waited. The moment he leaned out to fire. Her rifle cracked. Zix. The remaining attackers pulled back behind deeper cover. For the first time since the firefight began. The slope went quiet. Exhaled slowly. They're regrouping. Yes, Briggs said. They'll rush. Sloane kept scanning the ridge. They're waiting for something. Briggs followed her gaze. For what? Then they both heard it. A distant sound rolling across the mountains. Rotor blades. Heavy. Vast. Approaching from the north. The extraction helicopter. Laughed weakly. That's our ride. But Sloane didn't smile. Because through the scope she saw movement again. The surviving attackers were standing now. Not retreating. Not hiding. Watching the sky. Almost calmly. As if the helicopter arriving wasn't a surprise. Briggs frowned. That's strange. Sloane lowered the rifle slightly. Yes. Why? Her voice dropped to a whisper. Because they were never trying to escape. Briggs turned toward her. Then what were they doing? The helicopter roared closer now, its shadow racing across the valley. Sloane's eyes remained fixed on the enemy fighters below. They were delaying us. Delaying. She nodded slowly. For something bigger. Briggs felt a cold realization forming in his chest. What kind of something? The helicopter suddenly banked into view above the ridge, and Sloane saw the markings on its side. Her breath stopped. That's not ours. The aircraft swept lower, rotor wash exploding across the ridge. Stared upward. Then whose is it? Sloane's voice came out almost inaudible. Someone who wants to make sure none of us leave this mountain. Why would a rescue helicopter fly straight toward a firefight and not slow down? The sound swallowed the ridge. Rotor blades thundered overhead, blasting dust and gravel across the rocks. Everyone instinctively ducked as the helicopter roared past the saddle. But it didn't hover. It didn't circle. It didn't signal. It kept moving. Briggs stared upward in disbelief. That's not extraction. Sloane was already back behind the rifle. Negative. The helicopter swung wide over the valley and then banked sharply, nose dipping toward the slope where the surviving attackers were pinned down. Blinked. Wait, are they? The helicopter opened fire. A door-mounted machine gun erupted in a violent stream of tracers that ripped across the hillside. Stone shattered. The enemy fighters scattered for cover. For several seconds, the entire valley became chaos. Watched wide-eyed from his position against the rocks. They're hitting them. Frowned. Why would they do that? Sloane didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were locked on the aircraft, watching the way it moved, watching the pattern of its fire. Then she said quietly, "They're cleaning the field." Briggs turned toward her. Meaning? They don't want witnesses. Below them, two of the enemy fighters tried to retreat into the ravine. The helicopter swung again. The machine gun cut them down before they reached cover. The remaining attackers disappeared into the rocks. And just like that, the helicopter stopped firing. It hovered now above the valley floor, steady and patient. The sudden silence felt heavier than the gunfire. Slowly raised his head. Well, that's new. Briggs studied the aircraft carefully. Unmarked. Dark gray. Military, but without insignia. Then the side door slid open. A man stepped out onto the skid. Not with a weapon. With binoculars. He scanned the valley first, then slowly raised the glasses toward the ridge. Toward them. Sloane lowered her rifle slightly. Briggs noticed. "You not taking the shot. Too far. That's never stopped you." She didn't reply, because the man on the helicopter wasn't searching randomly. He was looking for someone specific. And when the binoculars finally stopped moving, they were pointed directly at her. A strange feeling settled in Sloane's chest. Recognition. The man lowered the binoculars. Even from this distance, she could see the calm in his posture. The lack of urgency. He spoke to someone inside the helicopter. The aircraft began climbing slowly toward the saddle. Swallowed. That bird's coming here. Briggs nodded. Positions. The SEALs tightened their defensive lines again. Rifles lifted. But Sloane stayed still, watching the helicopter approach. The wind from the rotors whipped across the ridge, flattening the frost and bending the tall grass against the rocks. The helicopter hovered 20 feet above the ground, then gently settled onto the saddle. The engine remained running. The side door stayed open. The man with the binoculars stepped down first. Tall, gray at the temples. Calm. Two others followed behind him. Armed. Professional. But not aggressive. They stopped 10 meters from the SEAL positions. Briggs aimed directly at them. Hands where I can see them. The armed men raised their hands slowly. The older man didn't seem bothered, by the rifles pointed at his chest. Instead, he looked past Briggs, toward Sloane. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind hummed through the rocks. The helicopter idled behind them. Finally, the man said, "Captain Drake." The name hung in the air. Glanced toward Sloane. "You know this guy." She stood slowly from the ledge. Her leg protested, but she ignored it. "Yes." Briggs frowned. "You want to share with the class." Sloane stepped down from the rocks, the rifle hanging loosely in her hands. The man watched her approach with quiet interest. Not fear. Not hostility. Something closer to respect. Or curiosity. She stopped 5 meters away. "Colonel." The SEALs exchanged confused looks. Whispered, "Well, that sounds official." Briggs didn't lower his weapon. "You mind explaining why a mystery helicopter just wiped out half a valley?" Colonel finally turned his attention toward him. Because they were no longer useful. That answer landed badly. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Try that again." But Sloane spoke first. "They were contractors." Nodded slightly. "Very observant." Briggs looked between them. "Contractors for who?" The colonel didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Sloane carefully. "You're bleeding." "Still alive." "That's more than most pilots manage after an A-10 crash." Muttered under his breath. "She's not most pilots." Seemed to hear it. His eyes shifted briefly toward the wounded SEAL. "Yes," he said softly, "that part has always been true." Briggs had reached the end of his patience. "Enough riddles." His rifle stayed locked on his chest. "You're going to tell me what the hell is happening on this mountain." The colonel looked almost sympathetic. "If I do that, Commander, none of you will like the answer." Sloane felt the familiar weight of tension settling into her shoulders. Because she already suspected what was coming. Finally sighed. "The aircraft you were flying today, Captain, wasn't assigned randomly." "I know. It was carrying something." "Yes." Briggs turned toward her sharply. "You knew." She didn't look at him. "I suspected." Nodded again. "A new targeting module." Frowned. "For what system?" The colonel's eyes flicked toward the wreckage valley far behind them. "Something that can't fall into the wrong hands." Snorted. "Bit late for that." His expression hardened slightly. "That's why we're here." Briggs slowly lowered his rifle a few inches. "So your recovery. Damage control." He gestured toward Sloane. "And her." Looked at her carefully again. She wasn't supposed to survive the crash. Silence slammed across the ridge. Blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Sloane didn't move. Didn't react. Because hearing the words out loud only confirmed what she had already begun to understand. Her voice stayed calm. So the missile wasn't enemy fire. Shook his head slowly. "No." Stared. "You're telling me someone shot down our own plane?" The colonel didn't soften the answer. "Yes." Briggs' jaw tightened. "And the reason we're all standing here." Looked directly at Sloane. Because Captain Drake refused to die on schedule. The wind pushed across the ridge again. Cold. Unforgiving. Sloane felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger. Not shock. Something quieter. Disappointment. She had spent years believing in the structure around her, the chain of command, the quiet promise that sacrifice meant something. But standing here now, that belief felt thinner. Watched her carefully. "You're taking this better than expected." Her eyes lifted slowly. "My father used to say something. Oh, when the truth finally shows up, it usually arrives late. The colonel almost smiled. And what do you plan to do with it? For a moment Sloane didn't answer. She looked past him, toward the helicopter, toward the valley, toward the long path that had led her here. Then she said quietly, "First, we leave this mountain." Briggs stepped beside her again. "And after that?" Sloane looked at the rising sun, breaking across the distant ridges. Her voice was steady. "Then we decide what kind of people we want to be, when no one's writing the orders anymore." Why would a soldier who had just survived betrayal choose not to pull the trigger? The helicopter blades slowed to a heavy, patient rhythm behind them. Dust drifted through the air. No one moved. Colonel stood calmly in front of the SEAL rifles, as if this moment had always been inevitable, as if the mountain itself had arranged it. Briggs still held his weapon ready. His aim hadn't wavered. Crouched beside, watching everything with the tense focus of a medic who had seen too many operations collapse into confusion. And Sloane Drake stood in the center of it all. Bleeding. Exhausted. Alive. Studied her face carefully. "You understand the situation now," he said quietly. "Yes. The module in your aircraft cannot exist outside controlled systems." "I know. And the people down that valley were hired to retrieve it." Sloane nodded. "But you hired someone else to destroy it," Briggs said coldly. "Didn't deny it. That was the contingency." Scoffed. "By shooting down the pilot." Met Sloane's eyes again. "That decision wasn't personal." Let out a weak laugh from the rocks. "They always say that." The wind swept across the saddle again, carrying the faint smell of smoke from the distant wreckage. Sloane felt the weight of everything settling in her chest now. The mission. The crash. The men she had fought alone in the freezing dark. And the quiet truth that someone far away had decided her life was an acceptable loss. Watched her carefully. "You've always been pragmatic, Captain. That's why you were selected." "For what?" "To carry something most pilots couldn't." She tilted her head slightly. "And if I hadn't survived, then none of this conversation would be necessary." Silence stretched again. Briggs stepped forward slightly. "So here's how I see it." His rifle stayed trained on. "You shot down one of our aircraft." "Yes." "You deployed contractors to clean up the evidence." "Yes." "And now you're asking us to what? Walk away." The colonel's voice stayed steady. "I'm asking you to understand the scale of what was at stake." Shook his head. "I hate that sentence." Sloane finally spoke again. "Where is the module now?" Gestured toward the distant valley. "Still inside the wreckage." "Intact." "Most likely." She considered that. Then she asked the question that had been quietly sitting behind everything else. "And what happens to us after we leave here?" Didn't answer immediately. The hesitation said more than words. Briggs noticed it too. "Oh hell no." The tension snapped tight again. Adjusted his grip on the rifle. "I knew this story wasn't going to have a clean ending." Looked between Sloane and, "You're not planning to tie up loose ends, are you?" The colonel sighed softly. "I'm hoping it won't come to that." Sloane studied his face. "Looking for something." "Regret. Calculation. Humanity. Maybe all three." "You knew my father," she said quietly. Blinked once. "That was a long time ago." He believed the system could still protect the people inside it. The colonel didn't respond. Sloane continued. "He believed loyalty ran both directions." The wind pressed harder across the ridge. Finally spoke. Your father believed many honorable things, and you stopped believing them. His expression hardened slightly. I started seeing the world the way it actually works. Muttered. That usually means someone gave up. Ignored him. He looked only at Sloane now. You're standing at the same crossroads he did. Am I? Yes. And what did he choose? His eyes drifted briefly toward the mountains. He chose dignity. That answer surprised her, but only a little. Sloane turned and looked at the SEAL team. Briggs. Yes, yes. Pale but still stubbornly awake. Men who had risked everything to pull a wounded pilot out of a frozen valley without asking questions, without knowing the truth, without expecting anything in return. The kind of people the system quietly depended on, and quietly discarded when convenient. Her leg throbbed sharply, pain grounding her in the moment. She looked back at, You said the module can't leave this mountain. That's correct. And you're willing to kill everyone here to guarantee that. I'd prefer not to. But you will. If necessary. Another long pause settled over the ridge. Then Sloane did something no one expected. She lowered her rifle. Briggs stared at her. Captain, whispered, please tell me you have a plan. Sloane stepped past them slowly, walking toward. Her injured leg dragged slightly across the frost-covered ground, but she didn't stop. The armed men behind tensed. He raised a hand, stopping them. She stopped 2 meters in front of him, close enough now to see the tired lines around his eyes. You're right about one thing, she said quietly. Oh, the module can't leave this mountain. Not at once. That's why. Her hand moved suddenly. Not toward the rifle. Toward the small device clipped to her vest. Briggs' eyes widened. Wait. Sloane pressed the button. Far across the valley, the wrecked A-10 erupted. The explosion rolled through the mountains like thunder. Fire blossomed upward from the shattered fuselage, sending a column of smoke twisting into the sky. For several seconds, no one spoke. The module was gone. The reason for the entire operation erased. Stared at the distant fire, then slowly looked back at Sloane. You destroyed it. Yes. You understand what that cost. She nodded. Everything. The colonel studied her carefully. And yet you chose it anyway. Her voice stayed calm. My father believed something else too. What was that? She looked at the SEAL team again. Then back at him. That some things are more dangerous when they survive. Let out a slow breath. The tension on the ridge shifted. Because now, there was nothing left worth killing for. The armed men behind him slowly lowered their weapons. Briggs finally exhaled, rubbed a hand over his face. Well, he said quietly, that's one way to end a mission. Shook his head with a tired smile. Remind me never to argue with pilots. Leaned back against the rock, staring at the burning valley. You just blew up the thing people were willing to murder us over. Sloane glanced at him. Yes. Feels weirdly satisfying. She allowed herself a faint smile for the first time since the crash. The helicopter engine continued humming behind them. The sun had finally climbed above the mountains, spilling gold across the frozen ridge. Looked at Sloane one last time. You realize this story will never be told. I know. No medals. I'm fine with that. No recognition. She shrugged slightly. I didn't do it for recognition. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Your father would have understood. Sloane looked out across the mountains, across the quiet valley where the smoke was still rising. Across the long road that waited beyond this mission. Maybe the world would never hear what happened here. Maybe the truth would disappear into classified files and quiet reports. But the people who had been here would remember. And sometimes, that was enough. She turned toward the helicopter. "Let's go home." The team followed. No victory speeches. No celebration. Just tired soldiers walking toward the sound of rotors and the promise of leaving the mountain behind. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose what kind of human being they will remain when power asks them to become something else. And sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It simply acts.